Good afternoon. I'm Leslie. Welcome to our Chatham House Roundtable. It is Martin Luther King's Day today, and it is also the inauguration of the 47th US President Donald Trump at just after 12 noon today, Washington, D.C. time. Donald Trump will be the president of the United States of America. And from everything we are reading, he will be moving quickly ahead with an extraordinary agenda. We are learning that there will be something around 100 executive orders, if that is possible, signed. They're talking about clustering them, signed all today. So, what a day. But we're here to talk about something very significant, very strategic, of the most important relationship in the world, not to each of us personally, but certainly to the world and to us professionally, the most important bilateral relationship. We have three extraordinary people to talk with us about this. I am extremely grateful. I consider them all people I have tremendous respect for, both personally and for their work. I admire you all greatly. So thank you for joining us. We're on the record. And I should say before I introduce them, we also have a phenomenal group of participants. And those of you who I don't know, make sure that you ask questions and I call on you. But I also have a number of people who haven't asked questions yet, but I know you're there, and I'm hoping to be able to call on you. So be prepared to speak. And we're being live streamed and recorded. So our three guests are, again, friends of Chatham House. I think it's fair to say Ryan Hawes is at the Brookings Institution. He joins us from Washington, D.C. He is the director of the John Thornton China Center. Ryan, you've not only been the leading thinker on China at Brookings with a phenomenal team, but you've also worked on the National Security Council, working on China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, 2013 to 2017. You've worked in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and you've traveled across Asia with the Chatham House team very, very recently on a trip to Singapore, Seoul, and Tokyo. The most important part of your bio, your recent book, you were co-author of U.S. Taiwan relations. Will China's challenge lead to a crisis? Brookings. Dr. Yujia, our in-house resident scholar, lead on China, writes extensively, and is a friend of mine and an extraordinary thinker, and joins us from the Institutes here in London. Ling Wei, thank you so much. This is the first time I've been privileged to chair you. I've watched you moderate others at the Council on Foreign Relations and in many other venues. We read your writing. You are chief China correspondent, the Wall Street Journal, author of the Wall Street Journal's China newsletter. And it is such a privilege to have you join us online. I hope that each of you, both of you who are not here, I know you're joining us from New York, will also join us in person at some point. So let me open this up. We know that we don't know what's going to happen when it comes to the incoming Trump administration and their approach to China. We know some of the headlines that, there's a bipartisan commitment to consensus around questions of China, that Americans' attitudes towards China hardened considerably during the pandemic. That there feels like there's a sort of linear move or almost a teleology towards tougher export controls and any number of measures. But surely, it isn't just from one president to the next and nothing changes. Obviously, there's a lot going on in China and in the Indo-Pacific. But just thinking at this of this from the perspective of the United States, of this remarkable and highly consequential transition from one leader to another leader, who are not only from two different political parties, but are just two very different people with two very different governance styles. The leaders matter. Does this leadership transition matter? How do you think about the change versus continuity question, and what do you expect from the Trump administration? And Ryan, let me also give you the gift of telling us what they should do if you wish to weigh in on that.
Well, Leslie, thank you for including me in this great discussion. I'm going to just start out from the US perspective, trying to unpack a little bit about expectations of the Trump administration's approach to China. And I'm going to disappoint anyone who expects a clean, simple answer because I don't think that one is available. I think that the picture will be fairly muddy, in part because in President Trump's mind, it is perfectly normal to have tariffs proceed on one track as personal outreach and pursuit of a deal occurs simultaneously. And so I think that there's going to be a fair bit of jazz-like improvisation as these two competing forces sort of interact with each other, and President Trump tests what is possible, what is available in terms of pursuit of a deal. Of course, the Chinese also get a vote in this. This is not a one-player game, it's a two-player game. And I'm sure that UGA and Ling Ling will help us sort of understand that side of the equation as well. But I guess what I'm trying to arrive at is I don't expect that there is some detailed 10-point plan locked in a secure safe somewhere in the West Wing of the White House that will be perfectly followed and executed in the coming weeks and months. But I will say that I think that President Trump has a couple of advantages as he re-enters this relationship with China. The first of which is that unlike every other American leader, he is perfectly comfortable praising Xi Jinping. He is perfectly comfortable giving respect to China in ways that no other elected official in the United States would be willing to do. The second advantage that I think that he has is that he is a deal maker. He is not an ideologue. He is not going to use sweeping language to talk about the division of the world between democracies versus autocracies. He is not going to talk about the triumph of liberal democracy or neoliberalism or anything like that. He is going to be ruthlessly pragmatic in pursuit of his goals. So those are a few advantages that he brings to the relationship. But to try to just address your question very briefly on what should we look out for to get a sort of a directional sense in the coming period, I think that there are a few things to watch for. The first is, does President Trump take control of China policy, of China issues? And I say that, it sounds rather basic, but there are a range of views within his administration on China. There are people who have passionately hawkish views towards China, such as the incoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. There are economic nationalists like Peter Navarro who believe that that is the game. And then there are people, I don't know how you describe them, who are just a little bit more benign in their interpretation of Chinese behavior, like Elon Musk, who have a very different view than some of his other advisors. And so will this be sort of a game of everyone canceling each other out, or will President Trump assert control and set the course on China policy? The second is how will China fit within his hierarchy of priorities? President Trump has talked a lot about the southern border and immigration issues as being a top priority. He also has a lot of other domestic issues as well. Is he going to, and this relates to the first signpost, is he going to have the bandwidth and the focus and the patience to be able to really sort of on a day-to-day basis try to drive things forward on the China account? And then that relates to the final signpost that I would just put out, which is how hostile will the opening moves of the incoming Trump administration be toward China? I think tariffs are already priced into the equation. I don't think that any tariff moves are going to, radically alter the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. But if tariffs are added to with efforts to declassify information about the origins of COVID, for example, I think that President Xi would interpret that as a personally hostile move towards him and towards the Chinese Communist Party. If, for example, the intelligence community wants to try to declassify information about the illicit wealth of Chinese leaders, past and present, I think that would be viewed as a hostile action intended to undermine the Chinese Communist Party's authority and grip on power inside China. And so those are a few things to watch out for. The final thought that I will leave with, and turn it back to you, Leslie, is that I would discourage us from just assuming that the second-term Trump administration approach to China will be a continuation of either the Biden administration's approach or the first Trump administration's approach. I think that President Xi is in a different place. I think that President Trump is in a different place. Second terms are about building legacies. They're not about getting reelected. And so he will have a different incentive structure than he did in his first term. And I don't think he wants his legacy to be one of blowing up the U.S.-China relationship. And so those are just a few thoughts that I hope can help get us started. This is the mental model I will use at the outset. I reserve the right to change it completely based upon events in the coming weeks, but that's where we're starting.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up question before I come to you, Yujia. Do you anticipate, do you think that the Biden approach to, thinking about the broader Indo-Pacific and China's role in it, bolstering mini-laterals, making those investments in trilateral cooperation, has it worked? And do you expect it to be central going forward?
Well, I think it had. So the first part of your question, I do think that it has been effective. The Biden administration's approach of sort of working from the outside in, building strong networks of relationships around China, and having a Asia strategy that includes China rather than a China strategy for Asia. I think that has broadly worked, but I'm not convinced that it will be the lodestar going forward, because I just don't think that that's the way that President Trump thinks. I don't think that's, President Trump's not a conceptual thinker. He is a deal maker, and the deals to be had are not with the Philippines and Korea and Japan. They're with China at the moment, and so that's where I think that President Trump's focus will be.
Okay, lots to follow up on there, but thank you for that. Dr. Yujia, your thoughts and your perspective. You've written extensively, especially recently, on China and how it's preparing for, if to to the extent that one can prepare for what's not fully known, which is what the Trump administration will do, not only on the economic card, but on Taiwan, on many different questions. But what are your thoughts on how China is approaching this, what its ambitions are, and how they will be affected or curtailed either strategically or tactically by this inauguration and the days and weeks ahead?
Thank you so much, Leslie. Delighted to share a panel together with a two towering figure of U.S.-China relations analyst community in here. Now, just to putting something different and also agreement with Ryan on the table in here is it will be messy. I think it will also be very messy from the Chinese end as well. Now, given my recent research trip back from Beijing, and what I realized, it seems to be there isn't really a consensus among the Chinese strategy community between how they're going to deal with Trump. On the one hand, there's a very strong sense of fatalism that U.S.-China relations will continue to signaling a free fall, whereas on the other hand, and actually quite in the majority, believe that Donald Trump is someone who is really willing to make a deal, hence a sense of triumphalism for China. I mean, you hear and you read from South China Morning Post this morning on one opinion post by saying how much Trump is willing to make a deal. But I think, unfortunately, neither sentiment has been represented hard enough among the senior policymakers in Beijing. I think what Beijing will try to do in the next few months is really trying to somehow strike a precarious balance that on the one hand, how to managing a very slow and very painful economic recovery on the one hand domestically, then on the other hand, also try to exploit certain diplomatic space that perhaps Donald Trump has left over for China to be able to fulfill that void. So I think that sentiment is to strike that precarious balance that China is having right now. Now, to begin with, let's look into the guest that the Chinese ascended to participate in inauguration today is the Vice President of China, Han Zheng, and he's not among the team of 7 standing committee members in the Chinese Communist Party. So that means his power would be far less compared with the existing sitting standing committee member. And then in a way, it shows that perhaps President Xi isn't quite sure and whether there has been a sense of consensus, whether on trade or on any other major sensitive issues has already been discussed with the United States. So perhaps the safest option, it is to follow the formality by sending the VP of China to attend this inauguration, like what he did with the King Charles's crowning in the UK back 2 years ago. So it's a sense of proper formality, and it also shows that even though the team between Beijing and Washington began to talk to each other, but isn't really any agreement or consensus being reached. Otherwise, they would have to send some senior standing committee member, one of the standing committee member to be there. So that's to set a tone already. Now, secondly, I think what we don't know for this stage is how heavy this tariff will be and how quickly the tariff will be imposed towards Beijing. And this will hit the Chinese in a much painful sense. That is to say, really compare with 8 years ago, 7 years ago, when the first round of the trade war, that the Chinese economy was doing much better, and hence the physical space and monetary space to be able to utilize certain toolboxes for the retaliatory measure against US tariff will be far more with much wider variety. And however, I think for this round, for Beijing, they have to be very targeted when it comes to retaliatory measure. And also, it will have to respond, because that's also partially, don't forget, the Chinese foreign policy, it is not only driven by leaders, but it's also driven by public opinion. And hence the Chinese leaders can't be perceived by being weak in front of US president and also in front of the US establishment. So Xi Jinping will have to choose very carefully on which sector, and China is prepared to retaliate. And also by having those sectors and not exactly adding a further blow on the Chinese economy. Now, thirdly, we may recall that it's not just US and China for now on the economic issues, but China already entered a very bitter trade disputes with European Union in the past few months already. Now, having two trade wars fighting simultaneously, it is not really ideal for a troubled Chinese economy. So I think for Beijing's option on tariff and on retaliatory measure will be quite limited. But having said that, and what I said earlier regarding Trump's transactional approach towards on his diplomacy and his indifference in terms of traditional transatlantic alliances or Indo-Pacific alliances, and this actually creating some space for Beijing diplomatically, and that Beijing is prepared to explore. And on the one hand, of course, to strengthen its existing ties with large part of the non-Western world. But also you have seen that recently Beijing has moved really slowly, try to repair its ties with Trump, with the US, the closest Indo-Pacific allies, like namely Japan, namely India, and namely South Korea. And of course, South Korea really depends on which president we'll get in the next few months, but it's less likely to be more pro-US, but it's probably more likely to be friendly towards China. Then, of course, Japan and India has also changed its tones and approach towards China, and that actually bear Beijing some opportunity. And then so diplomatically, that is also offer Beijing something very unusual. So having said that, and I think another question, another test for Beijing in here, it is how to handle the ongoing Russia's invasion towards Ukraine, and whether China and the United States might be interested in work together to push through some kind of peace deal. And if Beijing will be able to pulling that off, and that means Beijing and Washington will continue to be able to talk to each other. And now, finally, if we're talking about signpost, to see whether we're going to see a slightly better or more stable US-China relations, I would really judging on the personnels. So whether Beijing is willing to remove the sanction imposed by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And that would be if Beijing willing to do so, and that'll be a very clear sign that firstly, there will be some kind of trade deals between each other. And secondly, Beijing has much stronger willingness to improve this bilateral relations. So over to you, Leslie.
Thank you. Huge amount there. And I want to be sure that we come back to some of the comments you've made about diplomacy, about China's, what opportunities this creates for China, not only on the specific things that you talked about, but in terms of, at the UN and elsewhere. Ling, you have written extensively on questions of China, on the economy, on how it may or may not respond to the tariffs if and when they arrive. But I'd be very curious to hear your general thoughts or anything you'd like to add on how China is thinking about this transition that's taking place in the United States today, and its approach to the US moving forward. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Such a pleasure to be here and sharing this panel with Ryan and Yujie. Wow, it's really hard to follow up after those amazing remarks from both of them. But I'll try just to add a little bit of my thoughts here. I really loved those few questions laid out by Ryan earlier, about whether or not, Trump is actually going to be in charge of China policy for the next 4 years. That's one of them. I mean, from the Chinese side, one biggest question they're facing now is, what is it that Trump 2.0 want from China? It was very clear for the first Trump term, Trump wanted to use tariff as some sort of leverage, right, to get a deal with China, with the goal of reducing the bilateral trade imbalances. So that was pretty clear what Trump wanted. And as Ryan pointed out, he's not at all ideological. He proved to be very charming to the Chinese. And, there wasn't too much of the talk there was national security concerns, and there were talk about export controls, but the use of those tools really picked up under the Biden administration. So the Chinese really struggling to find that out. For now, as Yujie pointed out, I completely agree. What the Chinese are taking is sort of like a multi-pronged approach to the incoming administration. On one hand, you're nice to me, I'm going to be nice to you, at least on the surface. Over just the past few days, we have seen the Chinese have gone from getting no access to Trump's inner circle to being showered with attention, right? The call with Trump, the earlier was the invitation to President Xi Jinping to the inauguration, and then China's eventual decision to send Han Zheng, which, by the way, wasn't an easy one, and the call between Trump and Xi just on Friday, and we reported on Saturday that Trump actually was thinking about going to China as one of his priorities for the first 100 days in office. So the opening couldn't be better for the Chinese. So if that shows there are definitely still room for maneuvering from China's perspective. They're going to engage. As Yujie pointed out, China's economic pressure is piling up. They have a strong interest in engage with the Trump administration and negotiate. But again, the bigger question really arises here. What is it that you want from us? Another thing I wanted to point out is that Xi Jinping spent the time since Trump left office in 2020 to trying to fortify China's economy to withstand another superpower showdown. However, as Trump comes back, China's economy really is in worse shape than a few years ago, as Yujie pointed out very precisely. So does that mean Xi Jinping is going to yield to the economic pressure and to be really pragmatic and try to do things to mend relations with the United States? Will he, make really meaningful course correction on his approach, both in terms of managing the economy and in terms of managing the relationship with the United States? Obviously, there has been a lot of debate about that. But for now, we haven't seen any signs of him willing to make a real change. If anything, he's doubling down on the state-controlled approach to managing the economy. When it comes to foreign relations, he has repeatedly talked about, quote, struggle. In this US-China context, that means he's preparing the whole party, the nation, for a prolonged competition and strained relationship with the United States. So yes, he's going to be willing to talk, engage, negotiate with the Trump administration. And on the other hand, he's going to continue his approach from the last 10 years even. So what is certain right now is the uncertainty, exactly how much turbulence we're going to see going forward in this relationship. Also, Yujie pointed out a really crucial issue here, which is Russia's war on Ukraine. As Ryan pointed out, the second term is about building legacies. I would guess, one major thing Trump would like to accomplish, as he has said himself during the campaign trail, is to end this war in Ukraine, right? To end the war in Ukraine, conceivably, he would want Xi Jinping's help to put pressure on Russia. This is something that's in the core interest of the United States and Europe. Will Xi Jinping help? So that's also something we are going to keep a close eye on. So I'll just stop here. You have many questions, I'm sure.
There's so many things in here. This is tremendous. Let me ask you again. It's sort of a big question, but I invite you to answer it and go a little bit deeper. All three of you, and I'll start with you, Ling Ling. Do you think that? And I understand it's unknowable and unfair. However, here we are. Does Donald Trump's arrival at the White House make it easier or harder for Xi Jinping to get what he wants? And what is that? But could you say, could you use that as a lens for saying a little bit more about what this transition means? And if you don't want to start first, anyone, maybe I'll come to you, Ryan. Would you like to start first on that?
Ryan, for sure.
Well, I was actually curious to hear what Ling Ling and Yujie would say, but I'll get us started so that they can have something to build off of, which is that, I think what Xi Jinping most wants is just to be left alone. He wants China to have space to adapt, evolve, ascend in a manner befitting of his vision. And the more that President Trump becomes active, engaged, and aggressive in trying to challenge that vision, I think the harder it will be for Xi to carry forward the plans. I agree very much with what Ling Ling said, that rather than using President Trump's return to office as a moment for reflection, it appears, based upon what we can see, that President Xi is using it as an opportunity to double down, to really reemphasize the need for struggle and for fortifying China against the inescapable headwinds of a declining great power that is trying to cling to its privileged position on the world stage. I think that's the framing and that's the narrative inside China. The one thing that I would just offer, though, as a provocation for Ling Ling and Yujie, is that I'm not convinced that the Chinese leadership is quivering in its boots about President Trump's return to office. President Trump, he's strong, he talks tough, he's willing to exercise leverage and take risks in ways that previous leaders have not in the United States. But from Beijing's perspective, the Chinese economy has weathered the first Trump administration. The Chinese economy has weathered the Biden administration. And to the extent that it has had a slowdown, I think that their diagnosis is it's more to do with their own internal decisions and policies than it is to do with the pressure that the United States has placed upon them. And so if that is sort of your starting point, I would just sort of caution against expecting, assuming, or hoping that that China will be looking to quickly capitulate to remove pressure from the United States.
Ling Ling, can I get you to come in on this question? In response to what Ryan said and the broader question, and maybe also, on the global, I mean, you've sort of intimated that, but on the global question, I mean, in the past, when Trump came in the first time, I think we remember President Xi was at Davos, and taking the mantle of global leader. Obviously, there's a debate over who's having more inroads in the global South. I don't think it's the United States right now, one way or the other. But maybe you could add to what we've just heard.
Sure. A lot of discussion in the United States has been about, which party, which administration, is going to be better at building alliances, right? We have seen huge progress over the past 4 years under President Biden. And, given what was said from the Trump team so far, there are a lot of questions about whether or not the incoming administration will continue build on that progress. There are even fear that, the incoming administration will take a more isolationist approach, and hence that would give China opportunity to swoop in and make friends. So I wanted to just add a counterpoint to that argument. During Trump's first term, he pretty much pissed off a lot of friends in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And China didn't really take advantage of that. They didn't make many friends at all. Why was that? Why didn't they, not make much progress when the opportunity just, arrived in such an amazing way? For the second time around, maybe the Chinese have learned their lesson. Maybe they'll do better and be smarter about that. But I think, some of the core issues, unless some of the core issues have been resolved, for instance, the war in Ukraine, China has adopted this pro-Russian neutrality, right? The position. Unless those issues have been resolved, I find it really hard to believe that China will make huge progress in really, peeling some of the U.S. allies away from Washington, especially in Europe. And also, the industrial policy and China's products have flooded the whole world with some, threatening their own industries. We didn't just see tariffs rising in the United States. They're also rising in Europe and Brazil and Mexico and Vietnam. So it's not just one trade war breaking out. It's like a global scale, right? So another thing I just wanted to quickly add to Ryan's point about Chinese views about Trump. I do believe the Chinese prefer predictability over unpredictability. The Biden administration, their approach to China has been really tough, but targeted. And at the same time, there's certain procedure the Biden team abide by. To our reporters sometimes, they're too disciplined. But the Chinese love that. They, one by one, they know what to expect. So that makes it easier for the Chinese to plan, to minimize risks, to manage risks. With Trump, yes, Trump is so erratic, has proven, being an erratic leader. He can be really nice to you today, and 2 days down the road, he may throw something in your face, and that the Chinese might find really hard to stomach. So that's a really major risk. So all that said, I think I totally agree with Ryan in terms of likely general approach from China to the US. I think for the coming 4 years, China will treat Trump 2.0 with abundant caution. They're going to welcome the attention, the praise, and all that, but they're not going to make concessions very easily. They're going to drive a very hard bargain.
Thank you. Fascinating insight there, and estimation, I guess, of where we're headed. Yujia, on this, responding to what you've just heard, but also, it does raise a question. When you say you don't think that there's going to be much opportunity for China to make inroads with some of America's partners and allies until the Ukraine question is solved. I'm curious what you think about that, Yujia, especially in Europe, and in the UK, where there is some interest in, forging a strong relationship or some kind of relationship, certainly on the economic side with China. And you can say more about that. You know where I'm headed. Is that, contingent on China's policy with respect to Russia and Ukraine? Is there an inroad regardless because of the fear of what's coming down the road from Donald Trump here in the UK and in other parts of Europe? Or, what is your response to that?
Thank you, Leslie. I think I'm less optimistic regarding Europe or UK in general, but I'm more optimistic on China's diplomatic work within its neighbors. So, namely, within India, with South Korea, and so on and so forth, and other Southeast Asia countries, and particularly those non-Western countries have not taken a side on the Russia's invasion towards Ukraine. I think that is perhaps it's easier for Beijing to utilize its diplomatic capital in order to forge a better relationship. But having said that, and because of the particular structure of the Chinese economy that is much largely led by manufacturing, then at the end of the day, how much those manufacturing policies that perhaps will be served as irritant rather than something for forging a better diplomatic relations with Southeast Asia countries. And it's very unknown for now. But I think really for Beijing, they're really accustomed to that since having quite erratic neighbors ever since the founding days of the People's Republic. And hence, perhaps the biggest headache for Beijing is to deal with its neighbors rather than somewhere the great powers afar. Now, come back to Europe and UK. I think, yes, we hear the noise that UK or Europe like to strengthening its economic ties with China or still want to benefiting from China's economy. That is all very positive noise. But at the end of the day, but let's look into numbers. Who is the biggest foreign investment destination for the UK? It's the United States. And secondly, is Europe. It's not China. So the Chinese investment in the UK or in Europe has been made only very small amount, not large amount. So I think it's that particular economic structure already decided where's the national interest of those economies lies. So it's not necessarily even you hear the positive noise from the Labour Party or from other a select number of European government. But I think let's not be naive about it. I mean, it does exist in the positive noise, but actually how much this positive economic noise will be translated into diplomatic capital, it is very much in doubt. I think for sure, and really for Europeans, they felt deeply that because Russia's invasion towards Ukraine happened in their own doorstep. So until that question being answered, and I don't think it's going to be a very easy way out between China and Brussels and the Chinese and various other capitals of European countries. So, I mean, for now, I think for China and Europe, let's use the word, they're still going to be in the face of stalemate for now.
Okay. Ryan, before we open it up and for the entire panel, I want to directly ask the question about Taiwan. You're deeply expert on Taiwan. What are you anticipating? I mean, it feels like, my positive spin on some of the messaging that we're hearing out of the Trump nominees is that the incoming Trump administration is moving the United States back to a position of genuine strategic ambiguity, as in we really don't, just from what's been said, it's not clear that we know what the policy is. And maybe that's, back to where, Biden had obviously, whether it was intentional or unintentional, moved us a little bit away from that towards almost a position of strategic clarity. So is this just like moving back to the norm, or what is the policy on Taiwan going to be? Is there a prospect for a grand bargain? Should, is this what are the next 4 years going to look like?
Well,
Crystal ball.
You've asked a simple question with an impossibly hard answer. The honest answer is I don't know. But the reality is that I think that what you're pointing to is probably really important. That President Biden, particularly in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, felt it was very important to be crystal clear and unequivocal about the firmness of America's willingness to defend Taiwan. And that doesn't seem to be a posture that is going to transfer from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. I think part of that is personality based. I think that President Trump doesn't really like giving out promises or assurances to foreign counterparts. And so this isn't a Taiwan specific issue. This is just sort of a thematic global issue. But part of it is I think that President Trump feels the need to preserve a certain degree of dual deterrence, both deter Beijing from taking aggressive actions towards Taiwan, but also to induce a bit of caution on the part of Taiwan about taking actions that could implicate American interests and potentially American lives. And so that's the direction that I think that we're headed towards sort of a pre-Biden equilibrium. Whether it goes beyond that, we'll have to wait and see. But as you said, it is sort of difficult to anticipate because President Trump's advisors are so firmly supportive of Taiwan, and President Trump's own views are a little bit more uncertain and ambiguous. The one thing that I would say, though, is that President Trump is very sensitive about the appearance of weakness or softness. And so to the extent that Beijing sort of overplays its hand in applying pressure on Taiwan, I could envision a scenario in which President Trump would respond very strongly. Not because he has some deep personal or philosophical conviction about Taiwan, but because he doesn't want to appear as getting pushed around by the Chinese over Taiwan. But I'll pause there.
And Lingling, do you have any sense, and Yuji, of how China is reading the changed equation when it comes to opportunities and risks and their relationship with Taiwan as Trump enters?
Ryan's answer really is very insightful. I'll just try to add my 2 cents here. Obviously, also defer to Yijie about this hugely important question. From what I can see, I think Beijing views the risks across the Taiwan Strait actually rising, not decreasing. I think they view the Biden administration has been, has managed the relationship very, in a very responsible way, except for this that one visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, a couple of years ago. Overall, the situation has been quite stable. The Chinese, one fundamental problem right now we have is that the leadership in China really dislikes the current leadership in Taiwan, even more so than they disliked the previous leadership in Taiwan. So, we have seen this kind of constant military exercises, launched by the PLA, almost on a weekly and monthly basis, depending on, what the news development. So that really is quite, appears really quite a sort of like almost like a new normal, right? They really don't view the current Taiwanese president as someone they can deal with. So that to me and some other observers is quite a problem. There's no dialogue, there's no discussion. That's basically one question I want to raise. And another thing, just a small anecdote here. We talked about Xi Jinping's decision to send Vice President Han Zheng to the inauguration. Part of the Chinese, the decision wasn't an easy one, and part of the consideration really involved the delegation from Taiwan. They're sending quite a big delegation to Taiwan to the inauguration. So that also showed the sensitivity that the Chinese have over the issue involving Taiwan.
Thank you, Yujia.
As a political scientist, I can only chew the words. What I'm going to see is whether it's going to be a change or not. And let's look into on the 8th of March for this year's National People's Congress session to see whether on the work report for the Chinese government, the language on Taiwan has been any changes, and hence reflecting on its hostility, is dislike towards the current Taiwanese leadership. That's one window to observe that. But I think secondly, really for a presidency and the Chinese government, in order to make any move towards Taiwan, they will have to feel that they need to respond on public opinion within China. So at the moment, I think within China, the public opinion, the attention has not been given too much on Taiwan, but much of the attention has been given to the domestic economy. So I think really depends on how the Communist Party leadership want to play with that card. But I think let's also not forget about the public opinion that matters within mainland China at the same time. So ultimately, Xi Jinping will have to respond on certain public opinion over there. So that either bring the risk or lower the risk. We don't know for this stage. And let's also wait and see how Trump and his advisors going to respond over there.
Yeah, thank you, which gets us back to Ryan's initial comment. We're going to come to some questions. The first is from Cho Kong. And please, if you can say your affiliation and state your question. Thank you for asking a question.
Thank you, Leslie. Cho Kong, Associate Fellow, Side Business School, Oxford, former Chief Political Analyst at Shell. And my question is about climate change, which I believe is the biggest issue that we all confront. Trump 1.0 pulled the US out of the Paris Accords. Trump 2.0 promises to do the same. The first time round, she tried to seize the moral high ground, made very clear that he had globalist ambitions, but he didn't quite follow through. What will she do this time round, I ask? What might he choose to do?
Who would like to take that first? Ling Ling.
I have to confess, I'm really not an expert on climate-related issues. I felt very embarrassed here. You know, I think, you know, China has set very ambitious targets, right, for climate-related initiatives, you know, especially when it comes to emission of coal, you know, use of clean energy. They also have made tremendous progress in terms of the industries related to green energy. I think, you know, they will continue to claim the moral high ground going forward, and at the same time, not just the words, you know, in action, you know, the sectors related to clean energy will continue to get tremendous government support. You know, EV batteries, EVs, and all that stuff.
Thank you. Ryan, would you like to add to that, or Eugenia?
Sure, I'll just add one or two sentences, which is that I think that the Chinese will make two arguments in the coming period. The first is that there is no path to a clean energy transition that does not involve China, because China has such dominance over clean energy technology and willingness to use capital for deploying it, particularly in the developing world, that they are just fundamental to any solution to this problem. So that's the first point I think they will make. The second is that the most impactful thing that China can do for global emissions occurs inside China's borders, and that China is making progress more quickly than expected in reducing its emissions and transferring from coal-fired fire plants to other sources of energy. And so I think that that's where they will put their eggs. I don't think that they're going to try to become the champion of the Paris Climate Accords or the COP process, because that puts them in an uncomfortable position of being pressured by a bunch of countries simultaneously. I think they're going to try to keep it in areas where they have control over the flow of events.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just adding another 3 cents in here. One is domestically. Obviously, to having clean air, clean water is really the so-called tangible result for the Chinese government legitimacy. So that's a part of the regime legitimacy question, and hence Xi Jinping will have to answer to do whatever it can. But I think when it comes to the international stage, and Beijing will still play the card by being a developing country and also shaping the international rules and standards related to climate change according to China's preferences. And again, this will be really through the multilateral organization platforms, not through any bilateral agreement or deals. And also so far, if you're judging from the telephone call readout between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, I haven't hardly seen any climate change being mentioned at all. Actually, it started with fentanyl tariff and then so-called regional issues. So it seems to be both sides decided to drop the ball for the moment, but let's see, it might come back.
Yeah, not great, but let's move to the next question. The answer is good. The practical reality is great. Sorry, what? That sounded like a teacher judgment on the student. Simon Webb, will come to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. apart from the sort of discussion about, which has been fascinating, about Chinese aspirations, we have the reality of a huge buildup of naval forces on a scale which is certainly way beyond anything which China has ever done before, and is very significant at a global level. But what do you see as the aspiration behind that? I mean, we're recently seen the development of new large landing craft, but we've seen a lot of activity in the South China Seas. What is the perspective that this navy is being built up against?
And Simon, could you just tell us your affiliation? This is
Oh, I
super.
beg pardon. Yes, I'm a defence person. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Who'd like to come to that first? Ryan?
Well, I'll offer a few quick thoughts to get us started, which is that I think that the PLA, the Chinese military, was challenged to be prepared to provide a military option to President Xi for Taiwan issues by 2027, which is 2 years from now. And I think Simon's question is absolutely right. China has embarked on the most ambitious military buildup in peacetime of any country since World War II. And it raises questions, given the lack of transparency of the purposes of this buildup, as to what it's for. But so the first answer is that it's to respond to the challenge that they were given to be prepared for a military contingency on Taiwan by 2027. I think the more broad answer is that China would like to make it incredibly risk prohibitive for other countries to operate militarily along their periphery. They would like to push other countries as far away as possible to establish as much control as possible themselves over their surrounding areas. And that's the direction of travel, the ambition that they have. And it's really up to the United States and the rest of the world to decide whether or not we're comfortable ceding a sphere of influence in Asia to China. I think the answer is no, but we'll know more in the coming period.
I appreciate you using that specific reference, because the spheres of influence debate is getting a huge amount of attention right now. I'm quite shocked at how many people seem to think that the US under Donald Trump is going to happily cede. I certainly don't, but it is really getting a huge amount of attention right now. But can I follow up with you on one question on this, and then come to Lingling and Yujia? Do you see that the Trump administration, the layer below, if you look at the nominees and look at what the Pentagon is doing, is there evidence of momentum towards investment of this particular kind in order to be competitive?
I think that there's a recognition that the U.S. defense industrial base is lacking, and that the solutions to this problem may not reside entirely within the United States. And so by necessity, I expect it will push the United States to partner more closely with other countries that have better shipbuilding capacity than the United States, frankly, including Japan, South Korea, and others. And so I expect that's the direction that we'll head. And no, I share your view, Leslie. I do not expect that even under President Trump, that there will be willingness on the part of the United States to cede a sphere of influence in Asia to China.
Yujia, would you like to add to this?
Well, I mean, just one line. I mean, by no way I'm a military defense specialist in here at all. I mean, just really speaking from practical point of view is, has the Chinese Navy ever been put itself into practice for quite some time? And the clear answer is no. And then what would be the next? What would be the next opportunity for the Chinese Navy to be put into practice? So far, even if you're talking about building one of the best naval force in the world, and that would require the real-time fighting opportunity. And I think Beijing so far have not really had that opportunity yet.
Lingling.
Yes, I'll just quickly add to the perfect answers from Ryan about the point you raised, Leslie, about the sphere of influence. There have been a lot of questions about, the economic slowdown in China itself, how much that could affect China's ability to basically buy influence in the rest of the world. The short answer is that yes, it definitely will have an impact, but it won't change the strategic focus Xi Jinping has laid out in the past 10 years. Of course, China economy is struggling domestic system needs more liquidity and all that, that could affect initiatives like Belt and Road, right? We have already seen data showing China reducing lending to a lot of countries. Of course, partly also because they're struggling to restructure a lot of loans that have already gone bad. On the other hand, even just in recent months, despite the deepening economic problems within China, we have seen Xi Jinping's government, giving a lot of money to Africa and some other regions. So not at all. The strategic goal hasn't changed, but on the margin, it might affect the scale of their spending.
Let me, since we're coming to the end, I'm just going to put a couple of questions to you that have come from the audience, and I'm going to give them to you in brief form, and you can choose what you answer in your closing comments. And we'll go, I guess, in reverse order of how we started. One is about decoupling. How far do you expect, what are the limits? How far do you anticipate further decoupling, if that's even the appropriate term, accurate term, of the US and China? And where do you imagine it to be? Where's the sharp edge going to be? Second question, how much pressure is there going to be on Europe? We've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could say more. How much pressure do you expect the Trump administration to put on Europe to align with US export controls, investment screening, any other number of steps? Is the pressure going to be intense? Is there going to be linkage on tariffs to, the China question, tariffs on Europe and China policy? Where do you imagine that going? And then a final question from a Harvard professor, how do you characterize the relationship in IR terms? Is it hedging? Is it containment? Are any of our kind of conceptual anchors equipped for capturing this period of international relations? So, Gia, I'm going to start with you, and don't take all of them, take the part you want, and then I'll come to Ling Ling and Ryan.
Okay, just very quickly, I'll try to answer three of them. Decoupling, I think decoupling is most likely continue to take place in the high-tech sector. And that's one thing which United States won't give up for sure. So that decoupling is happening, but actually decoupling between people to people, exchange between China and the United States, that will continue, as what we have seen this weekend happen, what happened with the TikTok refugee and flooded into the Chinese app Red Notes. So that decoupling in different directions in different sectors. Now, secondly, on Europe, I think overall within Brussels, there seems to be a view that they want to have a greater coordination, transatlantic coordination towards China with Washington for sure. But then this also largely depends on to what extent and how much European Commission and European Council will be able to exert its influence on its major member states for now in its own political turmoil. So I think it's really not a foreign policy question, but it's really a domestic politics question for major European economy, how much it can get their own household in good order, and hence dealing with China. Now, lastly, the question is on the perfect IR question. I think I'm still holding my view. It is about containment. It's about that sense of realist views on the containment strategy that the United States put forward to, and that China is looking forward to break that besiegement they have for the moment.
Do you have a way of capturing China's strategy towards the US?
Besiegement.
Sorry?
Looking for to break that besiegement, that sense of end of siege, and somehow Beijing's looking to break that besiegement.
Okay, good. Right, interesting. Ling Ling.
I'll pick the easiest question to answer, which is the first one, decoupling. It depends on both the United States and China, what respective government is going to do in the next 4 years. In terms of the U.S., I'll go back to the point Ryan raised earlier. Is Trump going to take full control of the China policy, and who on his team he's going to rely most on economic strategy involving China. Before the election, we had talked a lot about Robert Lighthizer potentially playing a huge role in the incoming administration. Lighthizer had a plan. It's called strategic decoupling. If that plan were to implement it, obviously Lighthizer not in the cabinet for now, but we don't know what kind of influence he will remain with the team, and also whether or not he will stage comeback of sorts. But what he laid out, strategic decoupling, whether or not that will become part of the agenda for the incoming Trump team, I think that's definitely something to be on the lookout for. On China, China has done a lot to decouple its own economy from that of the United States. And I don't need to give whole history here, but just in the past few years, foreign investment in China has collapsed. It had, to be honest, it had very little to do with the containment strategy from the U.S. It largely because China's own economic state, is not great. Many foreign companies are finding fewer opportunities to make money. That's the fundamental reason. And also on top of that, you have data security law, you have expanded national security law. Those things have all made things harder for foreign companies to operate in China. So it takes two to tango. During the first trade war, we remember very clearly, despite all the tariffs, American companies, European companies, they stayed, and in some cases even expanded in China. But over the past few years, we have seen a tremendous shift, a fundamental shift in foreign investors' attitude to China. So for both reasons I just talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Very, very illuminating. Ryan.
Leslie, I know that we're at time, so I'm going to be hyper efficient. And I think that UGA and Lingling have really addressed the questions well. I'm going to just take a step back and try to address a question that has been an undercurrent of the entire conversation, which is, what does Trump want? And I think, I've been thinking as we've been talking, and I think it distills down to three big things. The first thing that he wants is to create more opportunities for American people, American workers. And he believes that will require a rebalancing of global manufacturing, which has become over-concentrated in China. So that's the first. The second is, I think he really wants to gain greater control over what enters the United States. And that relates to illegal immigrants, but also to fentanyl. And that's a key theme of every statement that he ever makes. The third is, I think that he wants to reduce risk of major power war. He has a deeply held aversion to the idea of nuclear exchange. It's something that really rattles him. And so working to reduce the threat of that type of outcome with Russia, with Iran, with North Korea is going to be a front of mind issue for him. So those are sort of the big tent poles that I think that the China policy will develop under.
Thank you. The entire session has been excellent. I'm not surprised, but I am very, very happy about that. And those last three sets of comments were really excellent. It means we could go for a second hour. We won't do it. It is going to be an extraordinary ride. I think a great time to be working on the US and China. And it's going to be a big day. And the question of manufacturing, immigrants, fentanyl, we're expecting possibly a declaration of emergency at the US southern border, any number of executive orders enabling and facilitating a very tough crackdown. But lots in there for us to think about as we move ahead. And I hope that we can return to the conversation, maybe even in person. So thank you all for joining us. This is recorded. It's going to be made available, and we will update. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ling.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.